right, it's time to keep reading. What do I have before me? A book that helps you make change happen on your terms and not, leave you feeling like you're a helpless victim. It's a guide to adapting to change in our life and at the workplace. And it says we can think about future proofing our careers. Jason Pfeiffer is my guest. He's editor in chief of Entrepreneur Magazine. He's a startup advisor and hosts podcasts like Build for Tomorrow and Problem Solvers. Welcome, Jason, to Money FM 89.3.
Thanks for having me. So glad to be here.
Great to speak with you. So, the plague, the elevator, the teddy bear. How do you use history and what happened after the plague, after the invention of the elevator? How do you use these examples to buffer your arguments in this book, Jason?
Yeah, well, thanks. That's a great place to start. I really love it. So, so I have this new book. It's called Build for Tomorrow. And it is, like you say, all about how to turn moments of great change to your advantage. And I mix together stories of entrepreneurs that I've met who are extremely successful and are driven by their ability to adapt with stories from history. The reason why I love stories from history so much is because we know how they ended. The thing is that when we're having our experiences right now, we don't know how things are going to end. We can debate how things are going to turn out. We can try to predict as best we can, but we don't know how it's going to end. But the stories from history tell us how decisions really drove change and what the result was. I'll give you one really quick example. You had brought up the bubonic plague. So I was very curious at the beginning of the pandemic, what good possibly came out of the worst version of this that I could think of. And of course, that was the bubonic plague of the 1300s that killed upwards of 60% of Europe. So I called a medieval historian named Andrew Rabin. He's a professor at the University of Louisville. And I asked him, and he said, a number of great things came out of the bubonic plague, but one of the big ones was that the bubonic plague killed so many serfs. This was a lord and serf system. It was an economy of slavery at the time, and it killed so many serfs that lords had to start competing for the serfs to come work for them. And the serfs, who had never been paid for their labor before, realized that they now had an opportunity to shift the dynamic and actually start to demand compensation from the lords, which is to say that the very beginning of the employment contract, as we know it, the reason why people are listening to us talk today actually came out of that moment. And that's why it's so important.
The plague led to emancipation for serfs, in a way.
In a way, it's a long and complicated history, but the very, very beginning of it, the opening of the door to the idea that labor has a value and that the person who does that work should be compensated, that came out of the bubonic plague.
Absolutely interesting. And what about the teddy bear? Why do you use that as an example?
Yeah, so here's a funny story about the teddy bear. So America had a national moral panic over the teddy bear in 1907. So the teddy bear was a brand new thing at the time. It had come over from Germany just a couple years before. And in 1907, a pastor in Michigan went on this tirade against teddy bears. He argued that teddy bears were going to destroy the human race. And his argument was that girls grow up to so think about the gender dynamics at the time. This is obviously more than 100 years ago. The idea was that a girl's only job in life was to grow up and become a mother. And so girls played with dolls. And the dolls, they thought, helped them develop a maternal instinct. But the teddy bears were now replacing the dolls, which meant that the girls would not develop a maternal instinct, which means that they would not grow up to be mothers, which of course would be the end of the human race. And I like this story because it shows us how quickly we can, in the wrong way, start to extrapolate what we see as loss. I think the reason why people are so concerned about change is because they often equate change with loss. They see something change and they say, well, this is going to challenge something that I know and I'm comfortable with. And I see that as loss. And then what am I going to do? I'm going to start trying to imagine what's going to come next. Because I lost this, I will lose this. Because I will lose this, I will lose that. And that's how we extrapolate loss, and we start to put ourselves out on a pretty crazy spiral. But what we need to do instead is extrapolate gain. We need to identify gain in the things that happen to us, the changes that we experience. We have to push ourselves to say, what good is going to come out of this? How can I be a part of shaping that and see that opportunity before other people don't?
That is a brilliant example, I think, of why we associate change with panic, why we fear change often, or why we do anything but change in our lives. When it comes to the pandemic, a lot of people are still grieving the fact that they can't visit some of their favorite places, still, like Japan, for
Yeah.
example. So, what are some standout examples of how to cope with a post pandemic world do you offer in your book, Build for Tomorrow, from the people that you spoke with?
Yeah, look, I think that there are a lot of strategies that we can use to cope with the true downsides of change, right?
Mm.
I think it's important to understand that just because I'm talking about how there are great advantages to change, that's not to say that every change is going to be easy or smooth, or that it's going to be nothing but upside. We will lose things. And so I think what we need to do, however, is as we are going through our lives, and really also we're thinking about what change could come next, is we need to be pushing ourselves to be thinking as adaptively as possible. I understand that during big moments of change, you may lose access to something that you really loved. Um, and so you used a great example there about how travel had been restricted for so long and people weren't able to visit the places that they really loved. But I think when we too narrowly focus in on things that we have versus things that we can gain, we start to create what is really a fixed mindset. We say that everything that
Mhm.
we can enjoy is something that's already been established, rather than thinking about how can I constantly be pushing myself to develop new ideas, new skills, new interests, such that I'm constantly expanding myself. This is something that we can do for our own personal enjoyment, obviously, right? I mean, I think that if somebody was not able to travel to Japan, by your example, and that was the only way that they could find enjoyment in their lives, well, they're going to be pretty limited in their enjoyment. But I think that if they were to be pushing themselves to identify on a constant basis new things that they could explore, things that are available to them. I really want to. I really want to emphasize that word available, because I think that oftentimes what we end up doing is we start to define ourselves or our enjoyment or our success by things that we
Mhm.
think that we should have or that we would like to have, rather than by what's available to us. Eh, one line that I really love to tell myself, that I would suggest others use as well, is I like to say, I will do the best work with the resources available, which is to say, let me not compare my work against what I could accomplish if I had more resources or more access to things, because frankly, I don't. I have the resources available. I have what's available to me. Let's figure out how to
Mm.
really live within that and then maximize
Mhm.
that.
So interesting. A lot of companies are grappling with digital transformation and what that means for their business. Um, and it's so complex, a, a thing to achieve. Really, it's like
Yeah.
building from the ground up. Are there any ideas in this book that are going to help companies on that journey of grappling with digital change?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the most important things that a company can think about. And the reason for that is because if you are not pushing yourself to constantly be thinking outside of the incentives that you have already built for your company, you will ultimately get disrupted in a way that you cannot anticipate. I'll give you an example. This one came to me from a guy named Hamza Mudassir, who's a disruption expert in London. And he told me that, oftentimes people think that Kodak was destroyed by the digital camera. And there's a good argument to be made by that. Of course, very classically, Kodak was heavily involved in the development of the digital camera, and then they basically put it on the shelf because they felt like it was a side project, and the camera film was what they should focus on. Obviously, that was the wrong call, but that's a kind of very straightforward way of thinking about it, and a kind of obvious one. The more interesting way of thinking about it is, who really killed Kodak? Facebook. And the reason for that is pretty interesting. If you recall back when digital cameras were new, they were pretty junky. The photos were pretty grainy. It wasn't clear what to do with them, and so people had them, but they didn't take them all that seriously. It was Facebook which gave people a use case for their digital photos, gave people a place to put their digital photos and a way to share their digital photos that suddenly moved people to say, oh, these digital cameras actually have a real valuable purpose in my life. And that was what ultimately shifted them away from camera film. Now, the point of this story is that Kodak, by creating an incentive structure in their company to only do things better, faster, cheaper, right? To only focus on efficiency, had really put all of their eggs in one basket, which was camera film. And they left open all these different ways that disruption could hit them in ways that they could not anticipate because they weren't even focused on the right competitors. We need to be thinking not just about how we can do our jobs and do them well, but also how we can build systems in place where we're taking very seriously the changes that are happening in and around our industries, and that we are empowering the people in our companies to be alert to that and to be developing solutions for that. That's the only way in which we're really going to be able to survive rapid change as companies. And it's something that every leader needs to be thinking about.
Fantastic insight. You know, a lot of people around the world are grappling with possibly losing their jobs, recessionary environment coupled with inflation. Your book talks about careers. Can we really future-proof a career when the future seems so uncertain? We don't know what to upskill for or skill for.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful point, and I think the answer is yes. What we need to be doing is, and I would really encourage everybody who's listening to this to think about this for themselves. I have a whole chapter in Build for Tomorrow, the book dedicated to it, where we have to separate what we do from why we do it. I think that we all too often identify too closely with the product of our work, which is to say that we think of ourselves as being defined by the thing that we do every day, the tasks that we have, or the things that we produce or the services that we provide. And while those are really important and obviously something that we need to be thinking about every day, that
Mhm.
leaves us open to feelings of disruption. Because if we experience some big change in our careers or in our industry, and it means that maybe the way in which we work or the product that we produce is suddenly not as relevant or needs to change, we're going to feel absolutely disrupted ourselves, right? If we identify ourselves by the thing that is easily changed, the product that we make, well, then we will feel completely unmoored the second that that change happens. So instead, I need us to push ourselves to think deeper, to even establish a single set.
I hope Jason Pfeiffer is still with us. He's joining us from Maine, and he did warn me that the internet connection was a little bit spotty. Back with Reid, and I'm speaking with the author of a great new book. It's called Build for Tomorrow. He is so fascinating. I couldn't end the interview without really hearing his ideas on several other points that we planned the interview around. So, Jason Pfeiffer, welcome back to the show.
I'm honored to still be here.
All right. Before we left off, we were talking about future proofing a career and whether that can be done when the future seems so murky and uncertain.
Yeah, and what I was talking about just before the break was that I think we do a dangerous thing when we identify too closely with the product of our work. When we say, "I do this, I am that." Instead, I think that we need to dig deep and identify even a sentence that we can use as a mission statement for ourselves that's going to be something that is unchangeable even in changing times. My example for myself, for example, I do not call myself a magazine writer, editor, or a book writer, or a podcaster. I say this about myself. I say, I tell stories in my own voice. Really important two components there. I tell stories, not magazine stories, not books. Therefore, no matter what happens, even if one opportunity disappears, I don't feel unmoored. I don't feel like I've lost my direction because I tell stories is something I can do in any way. And then in my own voice, I'm establishing the terms in which I'm going to operate. Now, I hear this from entrepreneurs all the time. I talked to, for example, the CEO of a baked goods company who was going through a massive transition. And he said, we bring joy to people with upgraded sweet baked goods. And that means that no matter what the product is, or no matter what changes from our consumers, we know that we can always bring joy to people with sweet baked goods. I think the more that we can drill down and establish that thing about us that does not change even in changing times, the more stable we will feel when disruption comes to us.
That is absolutely brilliant. And can I borrow your mission line?
By all means, take it. I just
tell
need credit.
Stories. In my own voice. Yes, you will get credit everywhere I use it. Jason Feifer is my guest. Built for Tomorrow is his book. You also host a podcast, Built for Tomorrow. And you say this book grew out of that podcast?
Yeah. So let me tell you this really interesting experience that I had that I think is going to be relevant to any leader, not just anybody in media, but really any leader. So what I have found is that oftentimes leaders, and I include myself in this as the creator of my own work, we don't know our audience as well as we think that we do. And that leaves us pretty susceptible to making something that isn't 100% relevant to them. I have a friend whose name is Rochelle DeVoe, who is in the audience insights research business. So she goes out and interviews consumers. She's hired by a company, goes out and interviews consumers and gets to understand who they are, who are the company's best customers, what are they looking for, what do they want, what don't they like, and then brings those insights back so that the companies can then change or adapt their direction to meet their best consumers. And I had found for my own podcast, when Rochelle started to work on my podcast, I'd hired her and a consultancy called Pen Name to grow the podcast. So she started to interview my listeners and found that they said they listened to the show because it helped them feel more resilient about the future. Now, this was a couple years ago when my podcast honestly was more of a history show about how change happened through history. And I didn't realize that people were taking it and applying it to their own lives. But once I had that information, I thought to myself, I can make this show ever more relevant to them. And then as I did that, a book grew out of it. And all of that happened because my listeners were doing something that I didn't know. I think we all need to drill into who our audience is and what they really want to make sure that we know so that we can serve them best and see the path for growth.
So I think it's amazing that in your answer, you anticipated my next question. Talk about being able to anticipate the future and move with that. But that's really interesting. Now we know that this entire show, we know that part of our audience is also writers. People who are
Yeah.
looking for that next big idea for their book. You have 60,000 personal followers on Instagram, 17,000 followers on Twitter, 23,000 on LinkedIn. You are a phenomenon. Now, you talked about the podcast, interviewing your listeners there. Did you also think about your personal audience and shaping your book to meet their needs?
Oh, yeah, I certainly did. And I'll tell you one of the most important things that I've found. I appreciate that you went through and collected those numbers. I'm flattered. Is I have a policy for myself, and that policy is respond to everyone, and I do. As long as someone is sending me a real personal note, right? I don't respond to like every publicist sending me some mass email, but every DM that comes to me on every single social media platform, I respond to. If somebody sends me a voice memo, I generally respond back with a voice memo. You know why I do it? It's really time consuming, but for two reasons. Number
Even the
one,
crazy ones? Sorry, Jason, even the nuts? I just had somebody on Twitter say, "Oh, Michelle, your name is associated with, a criminal." And I'm thinking,
oh,
obviously not the same person. So, I mean, do you
right.
respond to everybody, including the nut jobs?
No. Well, okay. So the nut jobs are their own story. No, if somebody seems able to be reasoned with, then it's a
Yes.
hard pass. I don't engage.
Okay.
No. Don't engage. If somebody has a genuine complaint about something and they seem reasonable, then I do engage. And the reason that I'm doing this, and most of the time, I just to be clear, like, because of the work that I do, I don't touch politics. I'm not engaged in hot button issues. I don't get a lot of crazy, angry people. I mostly get pretty earnest people who are following my work. And so the reason I do it is because, number one, because I will tell you something. The number one thing people want is to feel heard. And if you can give that to them, they will be your fan for life. They will. People DM me, and then when I respond, even just to say thanks or ha, if somebody makes a joke, they will reply and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, I didn't expect you to respond." And now I have, just by doing the most basic possible thing, I've delighted them. I've made their day, and now they feel a connection with me that's going to carry forward. So that's reason number one that I do it. But reason number two is because it is really the best R&D that I can do if I want to understand how people react to my ideas and which things really drive engagement and interest. The best thing I can do is be in touch with my listeners and my readers and my followers. And so I feel like just by being the DMs, just responding to people, I am getting a clearer idea of what people want from me. And once I understand what they want from me, I can fulfill that. And that's how I can build a brand.
This reminds me of an African proverb that says, I see you. And that really is the key to communicating and connecting. People want to be acknowledged and seen. That is so brilliant. Jason, is this your first book?
This is my, I co-wrote a romantic comedy with my wife a couple years ago, so that doesn't really count. So yes, this is my first business book, and I'm really excited to have it out. And
because I want to read the entire compendium. I want to read everything you've written, Jason. I need to make sure this is the only thing out there with your name on it right now.
This is
okay. I'll go look up that romantic one.
Oh yes, well that's called Mr. Nice Guy if you want a fun beach read. But yes, this is if you want to dive into ideas about entrepreneurship and business and how to grow and find opportunity and overcome adversity. Build for Tomorrow, the book. That's everything's in there.
Wonderful, and we can check out your podcast as well on Spotify.
Yes. So the podcast is also called Build for Tomorrow. I just dropped an episode today about why the phrase "nobody wants to work anymore" is completely wrong. In fact, people have been saying nobody wants to work anymore for 100 years. So you can go check that out. It's also called Build for Tomorrow, and you can find it on Spotify or anywhere you find podcasts.
That is so brilliant. Jason, thank you for your time. Absolute delight meeting you, and congratulations. Build for Tomorrow is his book, a guide to adapting to change in our life and workplace. And also, he's got some great ideas on future-proofing our careers, which I know you're interested in, listeners. Thank you for being with me here on Read. I'm Michelle Martin.
Money FM 89.3.
Money FM